only demonstrates that he was indeed the Messiah. Anyone who enters Jerusalem riding on a donkey, in obvious fulfillment of Zechariah 9:9, is saying, yes, I am the Messiah. So we certainly have a glimpse in that fulfilled prophecy of the self-consciousness of Jesus, that he truly believed that he was the Messiah.
Scholars have determined that Jesus fulfilled at least 4 major prophecies, each written a minimum of 3 centuries before his birth. Their content ranged from specific details about his life to the symbolic implications of his death.
Psalm 22 gives a poetic picture by David, written in the first person, of what the Messiah will be like in his suffering. And one of the things he says is that they will pierce my hands and my feet. Now, David wrote before crucifixion was known, probably by about 300 years. So Isaiah 53 says he was pierced through. It gives us the reason for his death. He was pierced through for our iniquities. So there's a purpose. He dies not just because he's a martyr, but because he's a substitution for sin.
A college professor of mathematics and science named Dr. Peter Stoner wanted to determine what the odds were that any human being throughout history could fulfill the messianic prophecies. So he had his students come up with very conservative estimates of the likelihood of any human being fulfilling certain of these predictions. And then they just ran the numbers. And what they determined is that the odds of any human being fulfilling 48 of these ancient prophecies would be 1 chance in a trillion. It
is mathematically virtually impossible.
To me, just as significant as all of those unique prophecies that were fulfilled in Christ is the complete drama of the Old Testament. The fact that the Old Testament is the story, the narrative of God's redemptive movement, his movement to deliver and save humanity. And Jesus is the climax of that movement. He is the climax of salvation history, the one who brings it off to fulfillment. You read the Old Testament, it's building. Jesus arrives on the scene and he is the fulfillment. And he recognizes himself clearly as the climax of God's plan of salvation for all humanity.
This whole case was sort of like one of those jigsaw puzzles where you don't know what the ultimate picture is going to be. You just put together the pieces, and as I was putting together all of the evidence, it started to take shape, and I sort of stepped back and I could see that it was a portrait of Jesus Christ. This was not just an intellectual journey. There was a very real emotional component to this, because I would find things along the way that would challenge me and my worldview on a very deep level. And I would recoil from it, and I wouldn't want to believe it. And there were so many reasons why I didn't want there to be a God, because I did not want to be held accountable for my life.
I didn't know at the time why Lee was so angry. I thought it was just being stubborn. He says, after coming through it, that it was conviction.
It seemed that the more Leslie's values were changing and her character was being transformed and the way she related to me and the children was changing, it would highlight the contrast with my life.
I was feeling fearful and angry as well that he was being affected by it in the way that he was.
The truth is, I felt like I was losing Leslie. She was being pulled away from me into this Christian subculture. I didn't fit in there. I'm the atheist. I'm the skeptic. And yet I felt like she was being pulled away, and I loved her. I didn't want to lose her. And it got to the point where I was so angry over the whole thing. One day I just reared back and I kicked a hole in our living room wall, just out of rage over the situation. It was a very ugly scene right in front of Leslie, right in front of our little girl. They were crying, and I didn't want to lose her.
Jesus's body was never found, and so and they predicted it. He talked about it, and it was predicted, and it happened. I mean, it's this easy. It's as simple as that. We just tend to complicate it, man.
No, not physically, not his physical body. So when they came the following morning and rolled back the great stone in front of the tomb, and he wasn't there. No, it must have been dark in that. I don't know. They must have missed him. No, I don't think physically a physical body can rise.
I don't think that he was yanked out of that or physically walked out and walked down the street and met with him. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
For more than a year, I'd investigated the historical record for the reliability of the New Testament. I'd looked at the identity of Jesus. But now it was time to look at the ultimate evidence for who he really was, the purported resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And for that, I went to the best scholars that I could track down.
William Lane Craig, Biola University. Gary Habermas, Liberty University. Michael Licona, North American Mission Board.
You see, while Jesus was on earth, he made some really radical claims. He claimed to be the uniquely divine servant of God, and he claimed that the only way that we could get to God would be through him. Now, I submit to you that if one of your professors made some claims like that, you would think that he or she was a few French fries short of a Happy Meal. Those are some really audacious claims. Well, a lot of Jesus critics responded to him the same way that you or I would respond to someone making those claims today. Oh yeah, pal? You really think that's who you are? Well, tell you what, why don't you show it to us? Why don't you give us a sign? Show us a miracle or something. And Jesus said, well, I'll give you one miracle, one sign, my resurrection from the dead.
The resurrection of Jesus really is the pivotal event of history. Anybody can claim to be the Son of God, as Jesus clearly did. The question is, can you back it up? What evidence is there to support your claim? What credentials do you have? And if Jesus really did return from the dead, that's excellent evidence that he is who he claimed to be, the one and only Son of God.
To weigh the validity of Jesus' resurrection, we must first consider his death. Many skeptics have proposed that Jesus merely fainted on the cross, or was drugged, and later escaped as part of a conspiracy. By contrast, the four gospel narratives collectively describe the events of his public beating, death by crucifixion, and burial.
Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Mark 15:15.
Chances of surviving crucifixion were extremely bleak. Crucifixion and the tortures that normally preceded it was the worst way to die in antiquity. A person was scourged to the point usually that their intestines, arteries, and veins were laid bare. And then after that, a person was dragged out where they were impaled to a cross or a tree and then left hanging there in excruciating pain. In fact, the word excruciating comes from the Latin, out of the cross.
Jesus was being tried and executed as a rebel leader. Now, in the Roman army, if you were responsible for looking after one prisoner of war, even if he was a rather insignificant prisoner of war, if you let him get away, your life would be forfeit in place of his, and life was very cheap. If you were looking after the execution of a rebel leader and you let him get away, you're in deep trouble. You're not going back home to your wife and kids. No way. Game over. The Romans were very, very good at killing people. They specialized in it. They prided themselves on it.
Perhaps the most definitive statement of Jesus' death at the hands of the Romans is recorded in the Gospel of John.
One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. John 19:34.
Medical experts have concluded that this account from John, an eyewitness of the crucifixion, is evidence that as he suffocated on the cross, Jesus' heart had ruptured.
There came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that he had cut out of the rock. Matthew 27:57 through 60.
All four Gospels tell us that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. That's a remarkable statement, and certainly a historical statement. The evidence for that is, first of all, Joseph of Arimathea is identified as a member of the council, the Sanhedrin, that condemned Jesus.
The presence of Joseph of Arimathea in the empty tomb narrative indicates that this is a historically reliable account of what really happened. His name would have been known to people in those days very much like a United States senator would be known today. It would have been very clear where his tomb was, so that there would have been no question about the location of Jesus' burial. It also, I think, indicates that